After what was billed a make-or-break EU summit, the 28 member states have reached an agreement on migration. It was announced after hours of discussions that went long into the night. The issue has been contentious from the start. And German Chancellor Angela Merkel says some divisions still remain. But French President Emmanuel Macron appeared optimistic.
Just a word to say that after 9 hours of talks and work, a deal has been reached. And it's good news for France. It's the fruit of combined work and it's European cooperation that won, as opposed to a non-deal or a national decision that would have been neither efficient nor lasting.
Well, that was the French President Emmanuel Macron. Our correspondent Brian Carter has been closely following all of those ins and outs of the deals over the last evening. He joins us now from Brussels. Brian, what more can you tell us about this agreement that's been reached?
Good morning, Belle. Well, it was shortly after 4:30 this morning that the EU leaders finally agreed on the final wording of this text right here. Now, the details still need to be worked out, but this text calls for a comprehensive approach to migration, which combines more effective control of the EU's external borders, increased external action, and the internal aspects in line with our principles and values. Now, 3 points really stand out from this agreement. First point, the controlled centers in member states inside the EU on a voluntary basis. The second point, to explore the concept of regional disembarkation platforms. And finally, that external migration management should be handled also in the multi-annual financial framework. Now, let's talk first about these control centers. It will be centers inside the EU where asylum seekers will be able to process their application, but it's still unclear at this stage which country will accept to have their center. It will probably be in countries that are at the front line of the migration route, like Italy, Spain, or Greece. The second point, the disembarkation platforms. We know this was a controversial measure. These are platforms for the same principle of processing asylum applications outside the EU for people that have been either caught at sea or stopped on their way to Europe. Now, the text insists that this will be done with the cooperation of African countries, of the UNHCR and of the IOM, but little details has filtered so far. And finally, on the third point, the multi-annual financial framework. Now, the text calls on for budget to be specifically allocated for migration in this budget, which is currently being negotiated for the period of 2021 to 2027. Now, other measures were also discussed, such as strengthening the external borders of the EU or increasing the funds to African countries. But where there was no agreement is on the most controversial measures, such as the reform of the Dublin regulation, where the text only says that a consensus needs to be found based on a balance of responsibility and solidarity. And also, finally, on the secondary movement of migrants, the text just says that member states should take all necessary internal, legislative, and administrative measures. What does that mean exactly? We still don't know, and we still don't know whether or not this can be done with respect to the Schengen zone and the freedom of movement within the EU. Belle?
Well, we'll be waiting to find out what those things do mean. Brian, thank you very much. Brian Carter in Brussels. Well, Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte told reporters outside the summit that he was satisfied with the deal that had been reached. But what will Italy make of it? Joining us live from Rome is NBC correspondent Claudio Lavanga. Claudio, it was a deal that Conte has hailed. He says it's a great deal. Is it as good as all that for the Italians?
Definitely, Belle. Well, for Italy, this is a massive achievement, if not a massive victory, because Italy has been calling for other European nations to share the burden of illegal migration for many years now, asking specifically for them to accept migrants, to open up centers for migrants where they can be taken right after they are rescued in the Mediterranean, for nations other than the nations of first arrival, which is, of course, Italy and Greece. Other nations in Europe should accept all these migrants, to screen them, to understand which one is an illegal economic migrant and which one has got the right of international protection, and so to apply for asylum. So this seems to this deal seems to say exactly that. It seems to specify that other European nations, at least according to the draft that we've been able to see, have accepted to open on a voluntary basis these reception centers. So unsurprisingly, the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte at the end of that summit sounded very positive, Belle.
Claudio, thank you
Today,
very
as we
much.
requested, Italy is no longer alone.
Will Italy accept closed centres on its territory?
That's a decision we'll take in government, but I'd say we're absolutely not invited to do that.
Well, Belle, this is not just a victory for Italy or the Italian Prime Minister. This is specifically a victory for the Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini, and his controversial decision to close down the ports in Italy to the search and rescue vessels run by NGOs carrying migrants. And as much as this initiative has attracted a lot of criticism from across Europe, well, it seems to have paid off, Belle.
Claudio in Rome, thank you very much. Well, let's widen out a little bit and look at what all this means for the EU as a whole. And to do that, I'm joined by Ryan Heath, Politico's Europe political editor. Ryan, before this summit took place, we heard talk of a doomsday scenario where the EU was being apparently split apart by issues such as migration. They've reached an agreement now. Does that bring us hope for perhaps unity in the future?
There is some hope there, but I think the fundamentals of the divisions remain. At the end of the day, you've got countries like Italy and Greece that are still going to have to accept the large majority of the burden of the search and rescue, of the processing of people who are arriving either as refugees or who are the victims or people who are enabled by people smugglers. So you're not going to see these numbers really changing. What you're going to see a little bit different is what happens to them when they are rescued. But at the end of the day, these are voluntary systems, which is the opposite of what the EU institutions were pushing for back in 2016. It's very much a win for the Viktor Orbáns, for the Giuseppe Contes. So yes, there is a deal that says we have a European outcome. So that is something Macron and Merkel wanted. But the substance of that deal is quite vague. It's not as tough as some of the discussions we were seeing earlier in the week, which really were pushing for those offshore processing centers, for turning the boats back. But it's moving in that direction of being harder on migration. So none of that is the right mood music for European unity.
Well, so that's day one. Day two is just starting of this summit, and we know that the leaders are going to get a small lie-in to make up for the 5 a.m. finish last night. What can we expect on the agenda today?
Well, Theresa May is the one who gets the biggest lie-in of all. She's not really a significant part of today's events. But what they're going to talk about first is Brexit. Usually these are very quick discussions, and they will probably be quick again today because Theresa May hasn't even been able to unite her own cabinet. So the EU 27 don't know what they're dealing with in terms of what Britain wants from this final deal. So there's definitely not going to be a final deal today, which is very much against the expectations that were being set up until a few weeks ago. So that puts us towards a tougher scenario in Brexit, where there might be no deal as a result of Brexit Day. There's just one summit left to get it right, if, as expected, we don't see that result from today's discussion. Then they'll move on to a discussion about the Eurozone. Germany and France have some ideas of how they should be completing all of the infrastructure around the Eurozone, that economic and monetary union. But up to 12 countries are saying, well, we never signed up to this idea. You have to consult us more. We want it to be done differently. And that's a very different dynamic to what Emmanuel Macron hoped for when he gave his big vision of Europe speeches last year. It's not what Angela Merkel is used to. Even if she has to do some tough negotiating, she is used to being the one who leads Europe, who pulls it together. And that is not the message that we're getting from a lot of those countries now. The smaller countries are taking a note out of Italy's book, and they are fighting back.
Ryan, thank you. Ryan Heath from Politico in Brussels there. So what does all this mean for those ships that are run by charities that are picking up migrants in the Mediterranean? Well, let's find out a little bit more on that side of the story from Alex in the Cube.
Well, Belle, this has been about politics this morning. That's the headline. But really, we must not forget that this is about a crisis of human beings trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. And amongst all this, we've had non-government operations like this one, this charity vessel, Mission Lifeline, finally allowed to dock in Malta after a 6-day standoff with the Maltese and the Italian authorities as they discussed who was going to take responsibility and what should happen. Now, the Maltese insisted, along with the Italians and the French, that this ship disobeyed the rules and should have left the rescue to Libyan authorities. And a tweet in the early hours of this morning, 4:30 this morning, from Joseph Muscat of Malta, saying that this latest EU agreement vindicates the stance Malta took on this boat and its captain, saying everybody must, all NGOs must obey the rules. However, the NGOs themselves have been very vocal about this issue. They are saying that actually the tone from European leaders is one that they see as inhumane. It's turning its back on the suffering of the people, desperately trying to make this crossing. Médecins Sans Frontières, who are on the vessel Aquarius, saying that what we see today in several parts of Europe is increased ferocity and reckless disregard for the lives of migrants. So there is a real argument now about the role NGOs should play in the rescues, but there's also an argument going on social media this morning about exactly what was agreed. Kieran had a very interesting tweet about this, and he says, feels like the leaders have decided almost nothing of substance again, except perhaps some member states being willing to pay more to stop migration. Other people pointing out that perhaps this isn't going as far as it should. This is an interesting one from Lawrence, though, saying, he's a journalist, saying, calling this a migration solution is utter hyperbole. It's a thin political fix to pander to Salvini and Seehofer, and it raises far more questions than it answers. So, yes, an agreement overnight, but still a lot of questions about the role of NGOs and actually exactly what was agreed and who are the winners. Belle.
It's great to hear from the people at the heart of this story. Thank you, Alex, and the Cube team for bringing us that. An EU deal on migration was critical for German Chancellor Angela Merkel, under huge pressure at home. Here's what she had to say after that agreement was reached in the early hours of this morning.
Overall, I believe that it sends a good message that we came to a joint decision after intensive discussions on a theme that's probably the most challenging for the European Union. But I am optimistic that after today, we will really continue to work, even though we have a lot to do in bridging the different points of view.
Well, Merkel had warned that the migrant crisis was make or break for the EU, but the stakes were especially high for her. Jessica Saltz joins me now from Berlin Live. And Jessica, we're used to seeing Angela Merkel going into these meetings in a leadership position, sort of on the front foot. Have things changed this time around?
Absolutely. This summit was a huge challenge for Angela Merkel because as German leader, she wasn't going in with her own objectives, but rather was under an immense amount of pressure from her conservative sister ally party in Bavaria, the CSU, to really toughen up on migration. So she had to follow this approach to some extent, whilst also proving to EU leaders that Germany, with the largest economy in Europe, was going to continue to be active in working towards solving the migration crisis. And also, she couldn't go back too far on what was seen as a very humanitarian response in 2015 of letting nearly 1 million migrants into Germany. There have been humanitarian groups and left-wing politicians in Germany who have raising concerns over some of these measures that EU leaders are putting forward, such as disembarkation platforms outside of EU borders. So a difficult line for Angela Merkel to tread. And over the 12 years of her time as Chancellor, we have seen her taking the lead in these summits many times. But of course, there are new fault lines in Europe now, and of course Angela Merkel was faced in a bit of a standoff with the tough stance from Italy, and we did see her concentrating on forging bilateral and trilateral agreements on migration within this summit with countries such as Greece and France, and I think we'll see her do this moving forward. I think a decision that was reached by EU leaders that will be very important for Merkel to bring home to Berlin was the strengthening of the external borders of the EU. She will hope that this will diffuse some of the very strong anti-migrant rhetoric that we're hearing from the far-right party, the Alternative for Germany.
And Jessica, we're halfway through the summit now. Do you have a sense there in Berlin of what kind of reception Angela Merkel's going to get when she comes back?
Well, Angela Merkel's not exactly going to come back to Berlin empty-handed, but she will have a tough time trying to convince the CSU that any solution she reached was acceptable to them by their standards. She will be speaking to Horst Seehofer on the phone tonight. Now, he's an important figure because he's a member of the CSU, but he's also the Interior Minister of Germany. So he's an important mediator between the local government in Bavaria and Merkel's government. And he's been very vocally critical of Angela Merkel's migration policy, but he has been softening on this in recent days. Perhaps a sign that there might be some sort of solution solution between them, because of course if the government does collapse, Angela Merkel will lose her job, but so will Seehofer, so he has a lot to lose as well. But the toughest critics from the CSU come from Munich and come from Markus Söder, who's the Prime Minister of Bavaria. He has taken a very tough stance against Angela Merkel, one which many are saying is no longer about the issue of migration, it's about personal politics. And he will be meeting with CSU members in Munich on Sunday to discuss what Merkel has managed to agree in Brussels and whether or not he considers it good enough.
Yeah, so a busy weekend ahead for the Germans. Jessica Solz, thank you very much for that from Berlin. Well, for once, Brexit is not the top of the agenda at this EU summit, but there is growing frustration over the lack of progress in those talks just 9 months before the UK is due to leave the EU. Well, for more on that, let's head to London and we'll have our correspondent Vincent McAviney up live for us. Vincent, for Theresa May, another difficult EU summit. Already she's had criticism thrown at her from the EU 27. She wants to accelerate those Brexit talks. How likely is that today?
Good morning, Belle. Well, as EU leaders were arriving for that EU summit last night in Russia, Belgium and England were facing off. Now, as the other 27 members' leaders were arriving, the Belgian Prime Minister decided to give them some Belgium supporters' flags and some scarves as well. But when the Prime Minister, Theresa May, arrived, he had something special for her, a shirt with number 10 on the back, but also with the word Hazard. Now, the Belgian team captain is called Eden Hazard, but the Belgian Prime Minister is a critic of Brexit, so it was a bit of a Melania Trump-style, less than subtle message to start things off. Now, as you say, this summit had been sort of billed as the one that was going to be all about Brexit. It was going to be just focus on that, but events have somewhat taken over, with migration being the main issue. And for Theresa May, she really hasn't got her squad in order. They're still squabbling about what they want. So she went there knowing that she wasn't going to be top of the bill, and she, much like England, lost possession of it. Now, here in the UK, businesses and trade unions have been really vocal in the past couple of days, saying progress has not moved fast enough, agreement needs to be made. And the Prime Minister will get some discussion time today. She spoke a short while ago and said she is confident that progress can be made.
Brexit, I've been stressing that we want a deal that's going to work for the UK and for our European partners, and that if we work together we can support each other's prosperity and security. Now, we're going to be publishing our white paper shortly, and I want to see the negotiations accelerating and intensifying thereafter.
Theresa May will be going on a tour of European capitals next week to try to get some more groundwork done. And then she's taking her cabinet away on an away day to try to thrash out the details for that final white paper, which she'll bring back to the EU at the next council meeting in October.
Vincent, thank you very much. Vincent McAviney in London for us there. After weeks of bickering, EU leaders have reached an agreement on migration during a summit that was labelled make or break. It was announced after hours of discussions that went long into the night. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says some divisions do still remain, but French President Emmanuel Macron appeared optimistic.
Just a word to say that after 9 hours of talks and work, a deal has been reached. And it's good news for France. It's the fruit of combined work and it's European cooperation that won, as opposed to a non-deal or a national decision that would have been neither efficient nor lasting.
We heard there from the French President Emmanuel Macron, and now we're going to hear from our Belgium correspondent Brian Carter, who joins us live from Brussels. Brian, what's the latest from what looks like a very empty hall behind you?
Good morning, Belle. Well, I can guarantee you that it's filling up pretty quickly. It was shortly after 4:30 that they finally reached an agreement on the final wording of the text, which calls for a comprehensive approach to migration. Now, the three main points standing out are the controlled centers in member states to process asylum applications, these disembarkation platforms, and more budget within the multi-annual financial framework. Now, on the first point, the controlled centers, now they will be set up in some member states, but they will be done on a voluntary basis. And we still don't know at this stage which country will accept to have these centers on its territory. And Italy has already indicated that it wasn't very interested in doing so. Now, the disembarkation platforms is an idea we've talked about on this show. It's these centers outside the EU for people that have been either caught at sea or stopped on their way to Europe, where they will be able also to process their application. The text says this will be done with the cooperation of African countries, of the UNHCR and of the IOM, but we don't have further details at this stage. And finally, on financing and combating illegal immigration, the text calls for it to be included within the multi-annual financial framework, which is currently being discussed for the period of 2021 to 2027. There are other points in the text, such as strengthening the external borders through Frontex or increasing the cooperation with African countries and work on development issues, but there's nothing on the Dublin regulation. There's no agreement on this. The text only calls on the consensus that needs to be found based on the balance of responsibility and solidarity, and also there's no agreement on the secondary movement of migrants, only that member states should take all necessary measures. Belle?
Brian, I know that you've been up most of the night and keeping your ear to the ground, and I know that you're also joined by Elena Cavalonen, a Euronews colleague of yours. Both of you having your ears on the ground. So what can you tell us about what's still to come?
Absolutely. I'm here with Elena Cavalloni from the Italian service of Euronews, and she kept a close eye on what was going on the Italian side of the discussion. So what came out today?
Well, Conte, the Prime Minister, said that this summit was a success because for the first time we clearly see a wider support and a burden sharing over the migration issues. Now we have to see how many member states, which one, and how they intend to open their territories to welcome migrants and process their asylum requests. But nevertheless, this is a success, as this was the first EU summit for Prime Minister Conte. Conte, he is new to politics, but he learned quickly how to use the veto power on issues that are crucial for Italy, such as migration. So for his leadership, this is doubtless a success.
And a few weeks ago, Elena and I were in Italy, where we did a road trip to hear the voices of Italians and understand how they felt about this new government made up of the far-right League and the anti-establishment five-star movement. What do you remember from this trip?
But what I remember is that people were asking for a change, for someone different from the past, able to stand up in front of European partners for issues that are important for Italians. Migration is one of them, and of course also financial and fiscal flexibility. So I think that from that point of view, he's trying to maintain and to keep the promises that he made, and people were asking for this kind of attitude. And I think that the reason for which it was so tough is really to show how things are going to change. Now, let's see if actually, in fact, things will change after this summit.
Indeed, we'll find out in the next summit. Belle?
Brian and Elena, great to have you both there for us in Brussels on the ground. I can see the room behind you is filling up with those people who maybe haven't been up as early as EU.